politics here in the Department of Politics and International Relations. Roland is a professor of international relations and head of department, and I'm a senior lecturer in international relations. So we'll talk about 15 minutes each, which should give us enough time to address any questions that you have. I'm sure you'll bring up a lot of points. So without further ado.
Okay. Thank you very much, Aidan, for organizing this. I think it's now a topic, as you said, interesting everybody, but what I am looking with amazement at unfoldings of events, because this is a situation where we have a kind of governance by terror, which has been very successful, up to now, remarkably successful. I think the Assad Senior has established a system which there was a touch of genius in it. One would call it evil genius, but there's a genius in it, in the sense that he established a double minority rule, in the sense that the Ba'ath Party, under which name he governed, was a minority party in Syria, and within the Ba'ath Party he had a kind of shadow organization for the Alawites, but he did actually manage a very delicate balance, whereby he would not allow the Alawite system to be blatant. And when some of the Alawites tried to manipulate the system under Salah Jadid, for example, who was the ruler in the mid-60s, and make it overtly Alawite, he moved against them. And when his brother, for example, also in the 1980s, wanted also to make it also more blatant into a family, narrowly Alawite and family, Assad family affair, he also moved against him. And he balanced the system very, very delicately. Internationally, he also played a game of brinkmanship, which also was very, very interesting, in the sense that, for example, he is supposed to pose, the system is supposed to pose as an Arab nationalist, radical Arab nationalist system. And in this, it was to the left of everybody else, and also in front of everybody else when it comes to move against Israel and against the West. But at the same time, in the same very also ingeniously balancing act, he would go into Lebanon not to support the left and radicals, but to tame them. And of course, that was put in his positive scorecard in the West. He was seen as a moderating kind of influence, not a radical destabilizer. When Lebanon was seemed to tip over in the direction of the Palestinians and their left-wing allies, he moved in and hit them hard and contained them and saved the Maronites and established a balance of power. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, instead of also buying into the nationalist rhetoric, he actually sent troops to fight with the Americans against the Iraqis. In the Gulf, he also played a very delicate game. He was the most pro-Iranian, but he also allowed the Saudis and the others some delicate game. But that does not disguise that the system was a terrorist system, in the sense that you give the people the option of being co-opted. If they don't accept, then you hit them really hard. And there are many anecdotes about this. For example, there was Salah al-Bitar, who was one of the two co-founders of the Ba'ath Party. And Assad, he was over in his 80s, but Assad was worried about him. He set himself up in Paris and was publishing a magazine. So he invites him over to Syria, tries to win him over, talk to him nicely. It doesn't work. Then Salah al-Bitar returns to Paris. A couple of years later, somebody shoots him dead. Of course, nobody knows until now who did. There was an incident in Lebanon where some Islamic jihadists started to appear when Syria was there in the early 80s. And the Syrian intelligence said to them, "We don't want you here in Beirut. Go somewhere else." And they said, "We are not going anywhere. We're staying here. What are you going to do? Kill us? We want to be martyrs." So a few days later, somebody comes to the homes of a couple of them, murdered the wife and the children. The next day, all of them fled. So there's this blatant terrorism, but it's used in an almost medical way. The Syrians, since they had a problem with the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s, the Muslim Brotherhood actually, they were the ones who also engaged in some kind of terrorist acts and violence against the regime. So the battle went on for a while, but then the regime issued a decree saying that anybody who is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood will face a capital punishment. And it is retrospective. So even if you say, I gave up, I'm no longer Muslim Brotherhood, if you are a member and they catch you, then you are shot dead. And actually they went into the prison after that rule and killed a lot of the prisoners who were Muslim Brotherhood. There was a massacre. Then there was, of course, Hama, which is the famous massacre where the Muslim Brotherhood tried an uprising, the same as happened in Homs today, went to the mosques and in the microphones and everything. And then Assad's brother with his militia just came in, did what they're doing in Homs today, bombed the city to the ground, and then killed everybody they got hold of. So that was also in character, in the sense that you want to terrorize. That's how you govern. You terrorize people so that raising against the government would be so costly that nobody will try it. But at the same time, then you try to manipulate the system. Members of the Sunni majority were co-opted, as we see in Halab and Damascus, especially the middle class were given the business contracts and were made wealthy. So this balance was maintained by Assad Senior. It worked well. You used terror, but judiciously, and then you play the game, the diplomatic game, nicely, and the internal political game also nicely, and then you present yourself as the champion of Arab nationalism. Then it all went wrong, I think, in 2005, when the new Bashar Assad overplayed his hand and assassinated the former prime minister of Lebanon, Rafiq al-Hariri. Then all hell broke loose. Syria was thrown out of Lebanon. That was not only a humiliation, but was also a big setback, because Lebanon used to be a lucrative operation for the Syrian army. It was actually ruled by the Syrian intelligence, but the soldiers who go there, they are well remunerated, and there's a lot of smuggling and business, and all this kept a lot of Syrians happy. So losing that suddenly was not a very good move. And then the problems with the Gulf started because Saudi Arabia wasn't very happy. Rafiq al-Hariri was an ally of Saudi Arabia. He was actually a Saudi national, and his children were also Saudi nationals. So that created a problem for Assad because he used to rely on the Gulf countries, especially after joining the war against Iraq. And they supported him also very well. Now they withdrew that support. And then, so that even before this uprising, the system was appearing fragile. Then the deputy, the vice president, Khaddam, who was one of Assad's senior, very most loyal followers, was ran away and defected and became a critic. Before that, I must add that when Assad Senior died, Bashar al-Assad, who was not, as his critics never tire of, he was not his father's favorite choice for succession. Basil, his older brother, was the favorite son, but Basil died in a car accident. So this guy, who was an eye doctor in London, was brought in and trained into the army and given the heir apparent. Then when he came into power, or when he was coming into power, he did two things. First, he attacked some of the people from the old guard and tried to remove them, especially those who were opposed to him inheriting the mantle. And then he pretended that there is going to be opening, so-called Damascus Spring in 2000 when he came. And there was, people started to create some so-called civil society organizations, like a club, which meets in a flat. I mean, not even something in the open. People will meet in a flat and say every Monday or something and speak about it. They were left for a few months, and then the security cracked down. So he, on the one side, he cracked on the old guard of the regime, and on the other side, he cracked on the people, the promising young people, or the reformers who wanted to take him on his word. So he did alienate two sides of the bargain. And then, with all this, when the uprising started in Daraa, which was actually a minor affair, and at that time it was not even a planned thing. Some children went and wrote on the walls down with the regime. The security, in their own style, they pull the children in and torture them. This is how they do it. They teach people a lesson so that they stop it early. They don't want. But instead of the magic working as usual, the terror and people just saying that these people are not to be messed with, Daraa as a whole went into uprising. And that, I think, is what set the whole system out of kilter, because it was a system which was based on people responding to the terror in a certain way, to cower down. And then that would give the regime the leeway to show its magnanimity, generosity, and whatever. But when the people just didn't play by the game, the regime didn't know what to do. So their whole training was just to go into more terror. So they sent in the troops, bombed the people, starved them, and thought that this was okay. This will teach everybody a lesson. But instead of this happening, then every other city started an uprising, rather than Damascus and Halab, which now are also joining that. And I think this is probably goes to to prove a point which I think John Waterbury once made about the repression system. He said it's just like a bank. As long as not everybody comes to draw their money at the same time, it works. But no state has the capacity to repress everybody. It only works if you make an example of a couple of people and the other people just get the message. But if they refuse, you cannot repress everybody. And that's why the banks collapsed, and I think the Syrian regime went bankrupt and went berserk. And I think the worrying thing at the moment is that for the first time, I think, in modern history, we are witnessing live on television every night a kind of brutality which is, probably happened even in a lesser degree in the days of the Nazis, in the concentration camp, or in the Stalinist era, but not, of course, in full view of the world, or even in full view of the Russians or the Germans. But here you are seeing it happening. And the world also doesn't want or can't intervene. And there are, I think, two ways this is going to go. And I fear the worst scenario, which is the most likely, is a Somali type total collapse, because the regime's now back is to the wall. They have done all the worst they could do, and they know that if they stop now, there's going to be punished. They're not going to be let off the hook, because this is something which nobody else has done before and gotten away with it, especially not in view of the whole world. But of course, the other alternative is for the regime to collapse from within quickly. And this is, at the moment, doesn't look likely, because it has its supporters, it has its loyalists, and has the Alawite minority has been also completely, insecure, and they know that, because they have been involved in a lot of these atrocities. If they let go, they will also be victims. So I fear it is a Somali scenario and disintegration.
Great, thank you, Abdul Wahab. And now we'll move on to Roland.
It's difficult to follow. It's a gloomy prognosis, but I think I would agree. On the main point you were mentioning, which is about it being a terrorist state and the use of terror. Actually, when you go back to Hama in 1980, it's always difficult to what the estimates of the people killed in that operation, but they are generally thought to be around about 30,000, which is just horrendous numbers, at a time when actually that it wasn't really filmed. The difference now is that it is being filmed, but the degrees of terror that the regime is capable of is reflected in that earlier action. So I think the other point, I suppose, is also, I think that you are right that Hafez al-Assad, the father, was a supremely clever leader in the way in which he manipulated both external politics and internal politics to preserve the regime and to ensure its continuing stability despite having such a narrow base. And this is a real example of a successor coming in who's less capable, who also had ambitions to modernize to some degree, to open up. But as a consequence of that, undermined most of the base, some of the fundamental basis of support, both from the old guard and now from the bourgeoisie, middle classes, intelligentsia, who I think at certain points could have had a pacted agreement with them. I suppose where this leads to, in a sense, is also to talk about intervention. I suppose that's where I'd like to follow up. And I guess, when we're talking about intervention more broadly, there are, I think, two aspects for the debate about intervention. One is the sort of, which is the broader, the sort of, in moral, philosophical terms, the deontological question about what is the moral imperative to do. And I think in that sense, the moral imperative clearly is these massacres that are going on, all the criteria that one's been using of responsibility to protect. There is a some sort of obligation or responsibility of the outside world to come to try to assist the ending of this massacre taking place. However, intervention has also got another area of debate, of moral debate, which is sort of consequentialist, which is the consequences of the action. And this is the main area, is about whether any intervention would itself be capable of actually resolving the situation, or would it actually make it worse. And I suppose in the debate on intervention, that sort of broader normative as against more pragmatic issues are very intertwined in the way that one's in the analysis that states and others have about it. And so there's a second aspect of this which I think is important, which comes to my topic, is clearly there are also two discourses, global discourses about intervention. On the one hand, you get the discourse from within the West, particularly since the end of the Cold War, the whole issue of humanitarian intervention, issues Ada will talk about responsibility to protect, a sort of cosmopolitan discourse that there is an obligation to come in, or responsibility when some threshold is reached in terms of mass abuse of human rights. In practice, we know it's a sort of restricted cosmopolitanism. It applies only in certain cases, but not others. Pragmatic considerations come into the fold, in the sense that can one actually do something? As in Libya, the decision was you could actually do something given the circumstances. There's much less sense of the doability of Syria from outside forces, even from within the West. But there's also another debate, another discourse, which is very much from the emerging countries, from China and Russia, but also I'd say from countries like India, Brazil, Turkey and others, which have been fairly sustained a strong anti-intervention policy posture, a strong defence of the principles of sovereignty, the right to determine your internal affairs, a strong defence of political independence, that states should not be judged upon whether they're democracies or non-democracies, that all states have a right to determine their own political future. And also part of this is also, I think, from these countries, that international relations should be democratized. This is a Chinese phrase, the democratization of international relations, which means in a sense that the countries such as Russia and China should have a greater weight, or should be incorporated in any decision making in relation to international politics, and not just be driven by a Western agenda. And they take, in a sense, this other group, a much more pragmatic line in relation to the whole issue of intervention, and much more consequentialist, in a sense, arguing that the type of interventions the West engage with tend to result in worse results for the countries concerned. And I think, in a sense, that provides a little bit of the understanding about Russia's stance. And I'll just say a few words about Russia, and because that, in a sense, I think Russia is taking the lead position in the sense of resisting any move towards intervention. China is very supportive, a little bit more ambiguous perhaps, but essentially covered by Russia in relation to this. So I think it's more important to look at Russia, though many of the things that I'll say apply to China as well. What is it about Russia? Firstly, about Russia, there is, I think, it is undoubtedly, Russia has always had a very strong bilateral relationship with Syria. This was really rooted, goes back to the 1950s. The leftist, Arab nationalist, radical Arab nationalism within Syria was one supported by the Soviet Union. In fact, the first sort of real connection between the Soviet Union and the Middle East was with Syria. That relationship was particularly cemented in the 1970s, when Egypt shifted from being a Soviet ally to being a US ally. And then Syria became the key strategic ally of the Soviet Union. And in a sense, that was the counterpart. The Soviet relationship with Syria was the counterpart to the US relationship with Israel. It's part of that bipolar structure. And that relationship has continued into the post-Cold War period. I think there is much less of an ideological linkage between Syria and post-Soviet Russia. And I think in some ways it's still important because it has a naval base, and there are many links and ties between Syria and Russia. But I think one shouldn't overestimate, in a sense, that long-term alliance. Although it's important, post-Soviet Russia also had very good relations with other pro-Western moderate forces in the region, has very good relationships with Turkey, for instance, has developed good relationships with Saudi Arabia, has a good relationship with Israel. And there are many Russian Jews who live in Israel. So Russia's policy is much more pragmatic. Nevertheless, there is that continuing sense of a loyalty towards Syria, which is there. I think what is more important is really aspects of more what Russia would say to be more principled positions. Russia is against, in general, and this is really from very early on in the post-Soviet period, going back to Bosnia and to Kosovo, a strong position against humanitarian intervention, a strong position against, in particular, any enforced regime change. And this relates also when it comes closer to Russia's borders, in Georgia, Ukraine, clearly Georgia in particular, a very strong position of view from within Russia that the West is promoting regime change to weaken Russia's strategic position, and also in relation to Russia itself, in the sense that Russia is itself supporting policies which seek to undermine Putin's government. And I think in relation to Syria, in particular, Libya was a major precedent. That was actually a very controversial decision of Russia to abstain in the UN Security Council resolution in relation to the resolution, which as Russia saw was meant to be a humanitarian resolution, a resolution for supporting humanitarian support, but which they then saw as being hijacked by NATO for regime change. And in fact, Medvedev was the one who made that decision against actually the interests of Putin and most of the foreign ministry there. And one of the factors possibly why Medvedev lost the chance of being president subsequently. Putin called what the West did in Libya as a crusade and used exactly those terms. The Russian position is consolidated, particularly with the elections that are occurring in Russia at the present time, the opposition that has grown there. The opposition is perceived to be one which is supported by Putin, supported by the West, by NGOs and others. And you can see an intensification of anti-Western rhetoric from Russia, which is coming out very strongly now in relation to Syria, but also in relation to Iran. The Iranian connection is also one which Russia picks up on. Russians like to have a phrase, they have a popular phrase which it is not coincidental that, it is not an accident that, and they say in particular it is not an accident that Syria is being targeted when Iran is similarly being targeted at the present time. That part of the determination or reserve to weaken Syria, is linked to the very close relationship between Iran and Syria, and therefore that is connected as well. But the final one, which I think is also a more substantive position, which is often not brought about, which is I think a very strong position within the Russian Foreign Ministry and amongst Russian analysts, is the sense that Western policy supporting the opposition and taking a decisively anti-regime position is actually likely to contribute to civil war within the country rather than to actually lead to a resolution of the crisis. And that the, as it were, principled Russian position of Victor is that the only way to get a resolution to this crisis would be for all the parties to talk to one another rather than excluding the regime itself. And I suppose in relation to this, I suppose the particularities of Syria in relation to the region, I think as Abdul Wahab knows, in a sense, Syria is one of these key Axis states within the Middle East. When Syria is strong, it exerts considerable influence on the rest of the region, in Lebanon, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere. When it's weak, it tends to bring in interest of external powers. And you do get, in a sense, one of the problems about Syria, which intensifies the conflict, is that the external community is deeply divided vis-à-vis Syria. You get what is sometimes called the axis of resistance, which is Iran, but not only Iran, but also Iraq and Lebanon to some degree, Russia and China, providing some sort of de facto support to the regime. On the other hand, you get the West, United States, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, some of the new states, Libya, Egypt, newly democratized states. So you do get an external dimension which exacerbates the internal situation, when you get this mix of external influence, external interests with the internal divisions. And also you get within Syria itself, I think, that the opposition, I think the opposition itself is quite deeply divided, or at least not unified. At least there are significant differences between the Syrian diaspora, who are supporting much of this action. You get the Islamist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood. You get the confessional divisions between the majority Sunni population. You get the Alawis, but also Christian groups. And you have class divisions as well between the rural proletariat, the crony capitalist class, the incipient bourgeoisie. You get a complex internal mosaic as well within Syria. So I suppose I would say, maybe Somalia's scenario is a very bleak, but maybe it's not that much less bleak as a Lebanon scenario. We do have, Lebanon is not dissimilar in some ways to Syria in its confessional and different sectarian differences, the way in which external powers exacerbated the situation within there, and there you had 15 years of a very lengthy civil war. The other option, I suppose, is this collapse of the regime. I think the collapse of the regime would be dependent on two factors. One is, I don't think it will happen without external support. So there's a logic, as it were, for external support for supporting and strengthening the opposition. But also it's critically dependent upon the regime itself and the structures of support of the regime collapsing themselves. And I think here the evidence shows, as yet, shows that the regime looks fairly strong in the sense the military, the army has not really disintegrated. There are elements that have moved out. And there are very strong elements of support within it who also know that they have no option but to continue fighting. Because if they stop the fighting, they're going to be, in any post-regime scenario, they're going to lose their positions all their lives. And I suppose the final question, which I suppose leads to is about what role do external powers? I think sometimes there's an exaggeration about the degree to which external powers can contribute to developments within the Middle East. Clearly Libya was a case where it did tip the balance, I think, to some degree. Iraq was a case where the external forces really showed themselves to be impotent to developments internally. And I think in this case, I would say probably the external actors will remain fairly weak in relation to managing or contributing to a resolution of the crisis.
Okay, thank you, Roland. Right. Obviously it's great that we're all here to talk about situation in Syria on one level, but I think on another level it's quite depressing. Around 1946-47 people started to draft the Genocide Convention, which was eventually ratified in 1948. And if you'd said to people, I think back then, that 65 years later, we'd still be discussing how we should respond to, as Abdul Wahab has described, a terrorist regime slaughtering its own people, I think people would be, very despondent about that. And situations like Syria very clearly, I think, highlight the absence of progress, the fact that we really haven't moved on very, very much. since the Holocaust, and since time immemorial, where we've always had some form of interstate crises and little external engagement with that. And this is particularly, I think, apparent with respects to the evolution of the responsibility to protect, which was vaunted and widely heralded as something that was going to put an end to all this. There was going to be no more Rwandas, no more genocides. This was going to, be the silver bullet that was going to stop all these crises. And clearly, Syria has to temper those expectations. And what I'm going to try to talk about today really is why we still have this problem, why we're still asking, what should we do, why is it happening, why we have this phrase never again, never again, never again every couple of years being trotted out. I think Roland touched on that, and obviously Abdul Wahab did as well, the regional dimension. One of the key features that I think a lot of people thought was quite hopeful about Libya, the intervention in Libya in 2011, was the very proactive role that the Arab League played as an organisation that I think many of us in international relations have largely discarded as of little, if any, major importance. But regarding Libya, the Arab League unusually took a very proactive stance and supported military intervention, and Russia and China's decision not to veto the resolution was seen to be a result of this, that they were mindful of regional opinion, didn't want to annoy the Arab League, and therefore went along with this intervention. The difference, of course, is that, or the problem with that, is that the Arab League, like any collection of states, is not a neutral actor, and to a large extent I think is driven by the agenda of Saudi Arabia, which is often overlooked in this and has a key role in shaping what's happening in the Arab Spring, to the extent to which it's opposing the emergence of Shia power in Iraq, trying to check the power of Hezbollah, and when it talks about changing the regime in Syria and being in favour of democracy and human rights, it's worth remembering that it sent its own military into Bahrain to prop up the regime there, to put down popular protests. We often talk about Western hypocrisy, but Saudi Arabia's position throughout the Arab Spring has been extraordinarily hypocritical, but very much consistent. They are pro a particular movement, and whether you are on the government or the people's side in that movement, it doesn't really matter. And in that sense, the Arab League, I think, has played quite a nefarious role in this situation as well. The issue, I think, that really exercised a lot of people's mind was the Russian and Chinese double veto on the 4th of February. It's worth reading the draft resolution that they vetoed. There's no mention anywhere in that draft resolution about military intervention. It's explicitly ruled out, in fact. Now, I know that they're worried about some kind of mission creep that occurred in Libya, very, very obviously, but the draft resolution it's quite a watered down resolution. It does discuss the need for an inclusive dialogue, but really, at this stage, Abdul Wahab has talked about the history of that regime. The regime in Syria has lost all credibility, has lost all legitimacy, and for Russia and China to say we don't want to support this resolution because it might lead to military intervention, that's, I think, patently untrue. And secondly, to say, well, we don't want to prejudge the outcome of any political dialogue within Syria, again, is bizarre in the context of a government of the nature of Assad, a government that has steeped itself in blood. At this stage, it seems obvious that regime has to go, given what it's done, and it's a disastrous history. And unfortunately, what we see with respects to Russia and China's position, I think, is far less to do with people on the ground in Syria, and much more to do with this grand game of international politics that has been played out ever since the UN was established. Now, what we saw on the 4th of February was this charade that takes place every now and again at the Security Council, where people file into a room and veto or vote for particular resolutions. And we're still in a position where the international response to interstate crises is totally predicated on the views of these permanent 5 members of the Security Council, states that act overwhelmingly in the national interest. And that doesn't seem to me to be particularly surprising, nor is it essentially controversial in that sense. The UN was established with power and politics at the centre, and maybe in 1945 there was some logic to that, to try and avoid Third World War. But at the moment, it's untenable. The position whereby you have this explicit union between politics and law enforcement creates situations like Syria. Of course, we occasionally have interventions like Libya, but of course They are a function of a coincidence between national interest and humanitarian suffering. Where there isn't that coincidence, as in Rwanda, as in Darfur, as in Sri Lanka, as in the Congo, nothing happens. And we're prey to this. And it's also worth remembering this double veto that was cast by Russia and China. In the post-Cold War era, the US has used the veto more than all other 4 permanent members of the Security Council put together. Right? The notion that it's the nefarious Russian and Chinese doing this terrible thing, again, is untenable. In February 2011, the US stood alone in vetoing a resolution condemning the construction of settlements in the West Bank. At that point, of course, the US was very happy to use the veto and to say, well, we don't agree with it, therefore we're going to veto this resolution. Yet, when it comes to the situation in Syria, Russia and China's veto is an outrage. But no permanent member of the Security Council has ever entertained the idea of changing the powers of the Security Council. They've actually, one of the few things that they agree on is maintaining the veto. Because occasionally it's inconvenient, but overwhelmingly it provides them with a means by which they can prop up allies or block particular interventions that they don't like. So there's a collective interest in maintaining this. And of course the consequence of that we see, as Abdul Wahab has said, on a nightly basis in Syria. And the problem really is that the key, most prominent solution that's been put forward in the last 10 years or so has been this idea of the responsibility to protect. It's widely known. There's countless books written about it. I've got one coming out in a couple of months, but mine is a bit more critical. But you just type responsibility to protect into Amazon. It's just been churned out. Isn't it a wonderful idea? Isn't it fantastic? It's a sea change. Never again are we going to see the kind of things we saw before. And yet the bizarre thing about responsibility to protect is that for all the noise and the headlines it's generated, it doesn't actually change a single thing. In the 1990s, prior to the emergence of responsibility to protect, the Security Council expanded its interpretation of its Chapter 7 powers so that it could intervene in intrastate crises, as in Haiti in 1994. It did that a number of times, and of course a number of times it didn't do that, right? The issue in the 1990s, which culminated in the intervention in Kosovo, was the inconsistent record of the Security Council. So we have interventions in certain places, but we don't have interventions in other places. The responsibility to protect then, which comes out in 2001 and is ratified in 2005, comes up with this great phrase, responsibility to protect, and everyone can kind of nod their heads and say, yeah, that sounds good. But in actual practice, it doesn't change any of the laws or any of the procedures. Creates no new organ, no new treaty, nothing. It simply reconfirms the existing powers of the Security Council, but says, really, you should have this responsibility to protect. There's no mention of any obligation. And the US in particular was very keen in 2005 to distance itself from any sense that now we have an obligation. We want to have this discretionary entitlement. If we want to intervene, we will, but if we don't, we're not going to be punished for not so doing. And the entire basis of R2P then is predicated on this notion that, well, law doesn't really matter. What we can do is we can generate normative momentum in favour of intervention. We can have global civil society activists around the world saying you should do this and you should do that. And again, they have been very successful. There's many global centres for R2P, international coalitions for R2P, all these fantastic sites that, websites and offices that, produce publications and advocacy time and time again. And the rationale is we can put pressure, moral pressure, and use this term to force states to do the right thing. And of course, it's based on this notion that moral advocacy influences the behaviour of states. Now, where's the evidence to support that? Since it was established in 2001, you can point to a number of cases where this seems to have failed dramatically. The extent to which the international community of ordinary people mobilised against the war in Iraq and were simply ignored by the United States and the UK. Democracies that ignored their own people. The extent to which the international community mobilised in favour of intervention in Darfur, and that was ignored. In Libya, of course, there is an intervention. And what happens then is that all these R2P activists jump up and down and say, well, see what we did. We managed to get this resolution through. It's because of our pressure. It's because of global civil society that this intervention took place. And of course, in February 2011, or March 2011, it's difficult to say R2P doesn't work. But just a year later, despite the fact that the Secretary General says R2P has arrived, this is a new era, just a year later, we're confronted, even a few months later, we're confronted with a situation in Syria which demonstrates very obviously the limitations of R2P. The idea that advocacy can change the behaviour of states. I mentioned Iraq and Darfur, and that's advocacy orientated towards Western powers. The notion that Putin and the government of Beijing decide what to do with respect to Syria, are influenced in their decision about what to do in Syria by humanitarian advocates in Geneva and New York, is utterly implausible. These people don't even listen to their own people, let alone Western advocates. In that sense, it's not a surprise that we have Syria. It would have been a surprise if suddenly states had become mindful of moral advocacy and started to behave in a so-called moral way. And the problem, therefore, is that we've been distracted. We've been distracted by R2P and this sense that we can do the right thing by putting moral pressure on states. And we've neglected the key problem, which is the structural corruption at the heart of the United Nations. So long as that corruption exists, we're going to be here in 10 years' time talking about some new conflict, because it's predicated, as I say, on the P5's ascent. With respects to maybe trying to end on a somewhat hopeful note, the only thing that I would kind of see as being a potential way out of this situation, the idea of launching a full-scale military intervention into Syria is highly unlikely to happen, and I think also, as Roland said, on the balance of consequences, may be disastrous. I don't believe there's appetite in Western states to do that anyway, and certainly Russia and China are unlikely to support any resolution that promotes that. The only kind of glimmer of hope, I think, is what happened in 1999 with respects to East Timor. In that situation, we had very similar level of atrocities and abuses being committed by the Indonesian government on the island of East Timor. Russia and China again said, well, we will oppose anything that's done without the consent of the Indonesian government. But Russia and China did put significant pressure on Habibie at the time in Indonesia to say, you have to let in a peacekeeping force. Potentially, now that Russia has vetoed this resolution and has, travelled to Damascus and said, we're going to solve this problem, it has an awful lot at stake in what happens in Syria. And so long as the slaughter continues, I think we could see Russia beginning to say, well, you've got to do something, you've got to let somebody in, you've got to let at least a peacekeeping force in. And if the Assad regime was to say, okay, we'll allow some kind of peacekeeping force in, at the very least, that potentially could limit the violence. The problem with Syria, and the big difference, I think, between Syria and Libya, is that Gaddafi was widely regarded in the region as a pariah. Syria has links with key powers in the region, as Abdel Wahab has said, particularly Iran. If there was a non-consensual intervention in Syria, then I think it could become hugely explosive, far more so than Libya was. Essentially, therefore, what I would say is that what Syria highlights more than anything, apart from the propensity of humans to do terrible things to each other, is the corrupt nature of the United Nations, and also the failure of the responsibility to protect, to effect any real change. We cannot but say that this idea of changing the disposition of states through moral advocacy has simply failed with respect to Syria. And so long as we continue to champion R2P and neglect the reform that's so badly needed at the UN, as I say, we're going to be here in years to come talking about this again and again. And I'll leave it there. And I think we'll just open it up for questions now. I'm sure people have things to say. Maybe we'll take a couple of questions each, and just, do you want to take two at a time and like that?
No,
yeah. Okay. 1 and 2. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for all the presentations. I've got a question actually regarding recent reports on arming the opposition in Syria, particularly the Syria Free Army, and ironically this is coming from Saudi Arabia. And there was an interesting report in Foreign Policy of not a Somalian project, if to say, in Syria, but rather Afghanistan one. So I'm wondering what do you say about this? My other question regarding Russia's position, there's no mention of the arms deals with Syria, and wondering if there is something you can say about it. And finally, on the US position, although it might appear that the US is actually backing an international intervention, military intervention in Syria, it appears some people are saying that Obama is rather hesitant actually to take it, and that's why other actors like Saudi Arabia, let's say, say that we can't wait more. Thanks.
Yep.
First of all, regarding China, you mentioned China its standing is ambiguous. I think the Chinese Foreign Minister today talked with the Secretary General of Arab League, Nabil Arabi, told him you should allow the humanitarian aid. However, he mentions, that is a quote from him, we are not changing our policy to let any intervention under the pretext of humanitarian concern. So it's clear, it was not ambiguous, the Chinese standing. Second one, about the way out. I think the economic factor is very important. One of the known businessmen, Syrian businessmen, recently gave an interview for BBC, and they said the economic sanctions can play a big role because Bashar al-Assad, even he depends on the military from one side, but he depends on the merchant and the trade there, and there is many people losing their business there, and you can through this economic factor, you can hit, Bashar al-Assad. They started to feel that. The third thing is about Saudi Arabia. I think Qatar was the leading player in Libya, not Saudi Arabia. Qatar was the leading player, and even regarding Syria, before was the Prime Minister of Qatar was calling for to put the case before the Security Council, but because there is no alternative of Bashar al-Assad, as the Western put pressure on the Arab League to send the monitors, even the monitors do nothing, and even killing every day. So because they fear the West, there is no alternative. They fear that something will happen like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and they fear from the Islamization of the wave in the Arab Spring. So they have some concerns. So Qatar was pressing hard, but because the Western pressure on Qatar, so they lay back and sending monitors after monitors after monitors, but they do nothing because the killing happen every day. Thank you.
Do you want to?
I think the issue which Muna mentioned about Afghanistan, I think is a plausible scenario, because there is now no way out, in the sense that the regime seems to be intent on going all the way militarily, and actually if the reports which we heard from coming for the last couple of days, for example yesterday, they said a few people tried to escape from Bab Amr, and the Syrian troops arrested them. All the young men were killed, which is reminiscent of Ratko Mladic did in Srebrenica, and the women are nowhere to be found. So they are going to go all the way. They are going to massacre everybody, and as Aidan said, in plain view of the world. And in the same way, so we have I think Aidan could have added about the responsibility to protect, in that it also has encouraged the opposition to be intransigent, because the Syrian opposition were saying that we don't want to talk to the Assad regime, because the Libyans didn't talk, and they were expecting the international community to intervene. So this expectation of intervention has tipped the balance, even theoretically, that waiting for they knew that they cannot destroy the Assad regime on their own. But I think that the worry now for the whole system is that this regime seems to be on a collapse course. But what happened in Libya is that you have a mercy killing, in the sense that you ended the agony quickly by foreign intervention, instead of letting it, as Muna said, drag on like Afghanistan, in the sense that then you arm the opposition piecemeal, and then this might take years before the regime collapses, and this would mean that yes, you would have Qaeda come in, extremists, all sorts of groups will turn up, and you wouldn't control. I think what happened in Libya, from the own interest of the international community, you have a controlled collapse of a regime. If you have an uncontrolled and prolonged, and I think a point which is also about the position of the Saudis and the Qataris, we are witnessing actually what I call the mother of all sectarian polarization, in the sense that now, because also of Bahrain, the Saudis, the Shia in Bahrain are the majority. They also want democracy. The Saudis are against them, and the Gulf are against them, and the other Arabs don't care. Here, the Syrians see the Shia also in Iraq and Iran see that the Alawis are being singled out, and now there is the elements of a sectarian lining up, which would then, if the both crises continue, end up spilling over in Iraq, spilling over in the Gulf, and the consequences will be very, very difficult. I think I'll stop there and leave other points.
Yeah, I think I'd back that last point in particular. I think that the danger of this sort of fracturing into sort of two groups. On the one hand, the sort of Sunni dominated from Qatar and Saudi Arabia as against the sort of Shia resistance group from Iran to Iraq through to Syria and the Alawites in Lebanon is incredibly dangerous potential development, which could have major impact beyond Syria itself. And it's interesting in a way that it is extraordinary how Qatar has taken this sort of high-profile role in developing a foreign policy. I mean, it is one of the very, very extraordinary developments for such a small country, obviously very wealthy, to take such a sort of very dangerous in many ways, I think, prominent role in Libya and elsewhere. And I think it's a very interesting development within Middle Eastern politics. I think you were mentioning about the arms deals with Russia. I mean, clearly, arms has been a central aspect of the Syrian-Russian relationship. In fact, they didn't. I mean, the post-Soviet period, they didn't really supply many arms until 2005, when the sort of debts of Syria were eradicated, military debts, and then they started again. But also, you can notice even during that period that Putin did not promote certain missiles which were perceived to be threatening to Israel, and actually cancel a certain missile system in place there. But clearly our arms deals is important. I haven't got details. I mean, I'm not sure about how much they are arming them presently. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure there is much sort of open information about that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were the case, given this situation. And I think also, in a sense, this part of that crystallization on the regional level is leading to a crystallization on the international level, that you get this very strong position, which is partly based on Libya and feeling a deception of Libya, partly upon internal domestic developments in Russia, but also within China as well. I think, as you're mentioning, I think ambiguous is maybe not the right term to use, not wanting to be quite so ideological as Russia in its position. I mean, but it's very strong in the sense that it makes to make a complete separation between any humanitarian support and any indication of military intervention, an enormous suspicion that any sort of resolutions in favour of humanitarian support would become a mechanism for military intervention. So China and Russia are very, very similar on those grounds. And I think the economic factor is an interesting one. I mean, clearly, the regime is very dependent upon the sort of those economic and spaces of support. But I think when you get to the point whereby it becomes a battle for regime survival, and it's a battle of a degree of repression which you're willing to perpetuate, and your aim is essentially to escalate the repression to a level whereby the opposition in the end becomes powerless or gives up. In those sort of circumstances, I don't think the economic pressures are really sufficient to change the nature of the regime, unless it's within a broader context, whereby, as Aidan was mentioning, perhaps with whether you can get but there you require, a bit like Afghanistan, a consensus among the external actors about what should be done, and a consensus on the regional actors about what should be done, which are incredibly difficult to do given the differences between them. So once you have that in place, then you can exert pressure upon the regime to negotiate with others, with the opposition. But in the absence of that, when the external forces are so fractured and the regional forces are so fractured, it's very difficult to get that sort of consensus, which makes it possible to exert real pressure upon the regime and upon the opposition. to change their policy?
Yeah, just briefly on the Qatar question. I think Qatar and also Oman have been unusually vocal in a number of their positions, but very inconsistent as well in terms of their support for democracy and tyrannical regimes. But from what little I know, it seemed to me that Saudi Arabia was really behind a lot of this, was pushing these countries forward as a kind of the official, spokesman. But really, they were pulling the strings. Again, I'm not quite sure, but that seemed to me to be a relatively plausible argument. The idea of arming the opposition, I mean, I've heard people putting that forward as a possible solution. People said that about Bosnia, the Bosnian Muslims in 1992 to 1994. I mean, on one level, it's terrible that we end up in that kind of a situation where we think, here's what we should do, pump more arms into the country. I don't really see that's ever particularly worked. And you also have to ask the question, who are you going to arm? I mean, who are the Syrian opposition? But we supported the Kosovo Liberation Army, I mean, we, the West, supported the Northern Alliance, supported the opposition in Libya, with some, unpleasant consequences. These, just because you're against a particularly odious regime doesn't mean you're essentially a good person yourself. And I also think, obviously, a lot of this is already occurring. We don't read about. But if there was to be much more, the Saudi statement at that Friends of Syria conference, if that was to become more explicit, giving arms to the opposition, well, what's Iran going to do? How is that going to affect Hezbollah? Syria isn't as isolated as Libya was, and you would naturally, I think, bring in Iran, which is the nightmare scenario, into this, in terms of its support then for Assad. And I can't see that as being a good idea, but I'm sure it's going to continue to happen. And you also mentioned the US position. When you read people like Noam Chomsky and Tariq Ali and their views on America's role in this, it's, to my mind, almost a comical exaggeration of how nefarious the United States is, and it's everything that's ever gone wrong in the world, the US has been behind it. To my mind, I would have said that the US doesn't like the Arab Spring, didn't want it to happen, and would have preferred if it had all just remained as it was, stable and ordered. And maybe they're nasty people internally, but the oil keeps coming out to us. The situation of this uproar and this disorder wasn't, to my mind, on the United States' list of things to do. The idea again that Obama is itching to invade Syria, I mean, is it totally illogical? Totally illogical, particularly in the context of a presidential election. There's certainly just people within the Obama administration, like Samantha Power, who is a history of being pro-intervention, but the notion that they want to get involved and invade a country is peculiar. That wasn't what the draft resolution said in any event. It's important to remember that. The draft resolution didn't mention intervention at all. And it's also worth remembering, when the United States previously has known that a draft resolution was going to be vetoed, it simply hasn't brought it to the Security Council. When Russia and China raised their hands to veto the resolution on the 4th of February, nobody was surprised. I mean, they knew that they were going to veto it. This was theatre. This was like, let's give a public display of their opposition. So that was, an attempt to kind of portray the US, the West, as the civilizing influence in the Security Council, and these nasty Chinese and Russians are, blocking all this. There's a lot of politics involved in that as well. Perhaps more could have been done to appease the Russians and the Chinese, but I struggle to see anything in that resolution, that draft resolution, that to my mind came even close to military intervention, or came even close to anything that was unreasonable in that sense. But really, I think the US and Obama in particular, I mean, he's one of his people in his administration, I can't remember his name, said that with respects to Libya, yeah, we're leading, but we're leading from behind. We're in charge, but you don't really see us, kind of a thing. It was a classic statement, I think, that sums up Obama's pretty weak, uninspiring presidency, really, and the notion that he's got a strong foreign policy idea and he's going to invade Syria is just beyond bizarre. Okay?
Yeah, I have two questions. First one is about the role of Turkey, since it's kind of cornered there because the regime collapse in Syria would kind of be like it means bases of training for Kurds, and they've been fighting them for decades there. And they have the capacity to intervene, and they have the willingness, because we know that a couple of years ago they conducted a military operation where they attacked and they crossed the border without any, shame or something. And so I guess they will have a very important role to play in Syria, because this is basically it will be a regime crash there would mean for the part of Kurds re-emerging and arms and stuff. And the second one is if we take a cynical position and look from the point of view of China and Russia, we can see that in the Security Council these are the same actors, the same positions as in the intervention, as in the position about Iran. And if there is this hypocrisy where the United Nations didn't condemn the intervention in Bahrain, but they are so eager to condemn the intervention to intervene in Syria, does that mean that they are trying to get rid of one of the allies, which Iranian allies in that region, which might destabilize a form of intervention, a later intervention to Iran? Basically, because Israel showed clearly that it can intervene in Lebanon, and there is only one country there who can do nasty things who can oppose or something. So I think from the Chinese or Russian point of view, it's a preemptive move to make bolder steps towards Iran to prevent them.
Okay, we'll take another one. Yeah.
My first question relates to the sectarian character of the conflict. You mentioned that part of the legitimacy of the Assad regime was based on it co-opting significant parts of the Sunni population. And how far has the Assad regime lost that part of the Sunni population that it used to co-opt in the first place? And secondly, in how far has this moved towards conflict between the Sunnis and the rest, not just the Alawites, but the other minorities, especially as Aleppo itself, which is a bastion of minority presence, has remained mostly quiet during these past months. My second question is related to that, and it's related to the argument that we have to get rid of the regime. It's clearly a terrorist regime. The question then emerges, what comes in its place? Because unless you have an all-out ground invasion, which would pretty much try to control things as they emerge, you will have very little control on the outcome. And considering the extremely divided nature of the opposition and its failure to unite around a platform, the question really arises, isn't that a real obstacle to effective intervention?
Okay.
Maybe I'll leave for Turkey on Abdulwahab. I think he probably knows more on this than me, but I think with Turkey, clearly Turkey is a critical actor in this regard, and I think it's a pity in some ways that Turkey is, it will be a natural mediator, but Turkey has taken this strong anti-Assad position, but on the other hand is also very reluctant to intervene or engage with it. So it's slightly got in a position where its potential power to influence developments there is greatly restricted, because on the one hand it's not seen as a potential mediator between the different parties within it, but also it is very reluctant to militarily get involved, though clearly if the whole thing collapsed, it would feel it would need to get involved, I think. I think on Russia and I think I mentioned a little bit about the connection with Syria and Iran. There is a strong sort of conspiratorial sense within Russia and China that these things are connected to some degree. That what is happening in Syria and the Western support for trying to undermine the Assad regime is not disconnected with concerns with Iran. However, to qualify that to some degree, I think that when you're looking at something like Russia or China vis-a-vis Iran, it's not a simple sort of West versus Russia on that one. I mean, it's Russia does not want military intervention in Iran. There are lots of Western countries which do not want military intervention into Iran. But there is quite similar. On the other hand, Russia is against Iranian nuclear proliferation. Doesn't want Iran to become a nuclear power. So there is actually a solidarity, if you say, in this issue. And in terms of sanctions policy, Russia has implemented sanctions in China as well. So China is probably more strongly in favour of the Iranian position than Russia is. So it's a complex set, but certainly on the issue of military intervention, I think there is an aspect in Russian policy in particular, and Chinese policy, that if you set precedents, Libya sets a precedent, then becomes a precedent within Syria. So you mentioned the opposition groups then feel that they don't need to negotiate and therefore can bring in external intervention. This has an impact. So they don't want the precedent to be set again. In some ways that's quite convenient to many Western countries, because Western countries don't really want to intervene anyway. So it's a useful way of buttressing that. I think again with Abdul we know more about the sectional side of this. I think there's also an aspect of centre periphery as well, that some of the revolts come from the periphery which has been neglected. So you do get, as it were, Damascus and Aleppo or Halab maintaining a greater degree because more of the resources has been concentrated upon the centre than upon the periphery. And I think one of the aspects about Assad Jr.'s loss of power has been a neglect of the rural population, which was a mainstay, I think, of the regime under the Assad Senior. And I think, in a sense, also when you talk about the Sunni, I think in a way there's clearly an alienation of the middle class. And the middle class, I think, was willing to negotiate with the regime, to have a sort of pacted relationship, transition towards a more open. And the repression has led them thinking, well, we just have to get rid of them. So there's alienation on that side. But I think in general, your view about sort of how external intervention would exacerbate the situation, if that's correct, is something which, that was classically in Lebanon. External intervention there was piecemeal, supporting various factions against others. There wasn't a cohesive opposition to which they were supportive of. Different countries supported different actors, and it just made the situation worse in the end. I think that's deeply problematic.
I think Turkey is in a difficult situation for several reasons. First of all, I think Turkey, I think as Ayton hinted, or probably Roland, that it has been closer in the past to the anti-Western, Russian, Chinese anti-intervention. It has very close relation with Bashar al-Assad, because they were both anti-Israeli, and so they actually had an alliance with Assad before. Secondly, most of Turkey's trade routes in the rest of the Arab world go through Syria, and they are still going. Actually, they didn't stop them. Both Syria, Turkey, and Jordan still maintain the trade relations with Syria because it's vital for both of them. And but I think the way things proceeded and the atrocities that Assad began to commit put them in a very difficult situation, especially since the refugees started coming in. So they wanted to do something, but I think the bottom line is that nobody knows what to do except to arm the opposition, because I think in this sense, the veto has saved the Americans, because if Russia and China did not veto the resolution, then nothing would have happened. Now they are blaming the Russians for doing nothing, but even if the Russians didn't veto the resolution, as Aidan said, had nothing in it. It's just a kind of censure, and the censure is actually Syria is being censured by the media more than it would ever be by the council. So I think eventually what is going to happen is the arming of the opposition, because because nobody wants at the moment to do the obvious, which is to use massive military action against Syria, especially at this level. I think what people are hoping is that the sanctions and the attrition will ultimately weaken the regime, exhaust its military capacity, which would make maybe a military intervention at that time easier, especially if the opposition becomes stronger and takes over certain areas, and then the Assad regime becomes in a small enclave, then it will be very easy to stifle them. Now, regarding the sectarian issue, I think it might actually be exaggerated that the regime is actually trying to play the sectarian card, because this also happened in other Arab revolutions. The Arab revolutions all succeeded because the people as a people decided to ignore. In Egypt, they ignored the issue of Copts versus Muslim, or Islamists versus secularists, or left versus right. And suddenly they realize that they have one enemy and they want to get rid of him. The issue in Syria, there is broadly, I think, a coalition which involves Christians, Muslims, Alawis, all of. But I hear from some of the Alawis that because of this, the regime is trying to play the sectarian card. Nowadays, if an Alawi joins the opposition, he is regarded as a traitor by his community. They think that we have to stick with the regime because if we lose. But I think my worry is not the sectarianism in Syria itself, but the sectarianism around it. In the sense that, for example, now the Iraqis try to align with the regime, although they are doing it in one thing, for example, which happened is that the Turks wanted to have their trade routes and trucks going to Saudi Arabia go through Iraq. The Iraqis said no, we wouldn't do that because that would be undermining Syria. And so there are news that Iraq is offering funding to Syria to support it. There is also certainly indication that Syria is using Iraq as a conduit for goods and stuff. So it is not an easy thing. And I think ultimately this issue of saying that what is going to happen, that's also what has been said in Egypt, what has been said in Tunisia. And interestingly, for example, the Maronite patriarch came with statements which appear to favor the remaining of this Syrian Assad regime, saying that he fears that the Christians would suffer. But actually, the leader of the Christian Maronite militia in Lebanon came and contradicted him, and he said, no, the interests of Christians are in democracy, not with the dictator. And he is a dictator who we have suffered from. Why should we have him visit on our Syrian brothers? So it is not a unanimous position. There are some people trying to play the card, but it's not always working.
Just on the question about what would come after the Assad regime. On one level, I wonder whether it's do we really need to ask that? I mean, given how bad it is at the moment, people often say, well, you know, terrible consequences could occur if Assad was to go. Well, I mean, terrible things are happening now. Would it get worse? Is obviously, I think, the question you're asking, and I think it would get worse if there was a US invasion. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it would get worse if there was even a kind of a Turkey, Saudi Arabia invasion. But one way that you could get rid of the regime and not make the situation immeasurably worse, I think, would be, as I said, the hope that potentially, if Russia has invested so much political capital in this, to create some formulation whereby there's an inclusive political process, some peacekeeping force, and the logic of that process would be that Assad would have to go. I mean, Russia, it's worth remembering, was part of the post-conflict intervention force in Kosovo. on the pretext that we're there to kind of, ensure that nothing bad happens to the Serbs and to protect Serbian interests. But the logic of post-conflict Kosovo was that the Serbian interest was going to be essentially ignored, and there was nothing Russia could do to stop that. If that was the initial premise for Syria, we'd have an inclusive dialogue. In the course of that dialogue, with peacekeeping troops stopping the violence, obviously Assad would have to go. Now, there was a report from Chatham House recently talking about the extent to which many people close to Assad and within that particular community have started to, count their money and say this is going badly wrong for us, and potentially again here, as it becomes economically disastrous and the writing's on the wall, we can't maintain our regime here. Many of these people will start saying, why can't we potentially look for a way out, exile in Russia? We'll leave, take our money with us, and we'll never be seen again. And that, again, is a potentially hopeful situation. Obviously, Assad's nightmare scenario has been, dragged along on a jeep and beaten to death like Gaddafi. And I think he's, from what I know, he's less insane than Gaddafi. I think it's possible to reason with him on some level.
Doubtful.
Gaddafi sets a high mark for insanity, I guess. But I think that there is some potential hope there, at the risk of sounding hopeful about the situation. Maybe we'll just take a couple more questions because it is getting somewhat late. If anybody has anything, we exhausted everything. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope it was interesting for you.